Greetings from the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today we're going to take a look at the Sega Genesis Model 2. Now, this system was sent in by a good friend of mine over at the My Life in Gaming Discord server, and the reason why he sent this my way is because he was interested in installing one of these. Now, this here is a Sega Triple Bypass V2 Plus. Now, what this is it is a revision of the Sega Triple Bypass that was done by my good friend Zaxor, and what makes his version different from the rest is, for one, it has headphone outputs for the Model 1 Genesis, so you can restore the headphone jack, and as well, it has RGB outputs, so you can feed it back into the encoder circuit for the Sega Genesis to restore composite video functionality. So this is great if you want to get the most versatility while also upgrading your system. Now, even though he sent this my way, so I only installed this kit, I want to do something a little bit more for him. So, we're also going to be recapping this system. So as you can see here, I have a cap kit from Console 5, and I figured, you know what? I might as well throw this in for him. You know, he's a good friend of mine, and I feel that, like, with how old this system is, and since we're modding it anyways, we might as well, right? So, without further delay, let's get started. Alright, so I have the shell completely broken down because it really needs a bath. But before we cut to that, let's take a look at what we got going on here. So we got a VA1 Model 2, and in terms of like how I feel about these in a stock environment, the audio is atrocious, as it is for the VA0 to VA 1.8. Well, actually, all the Model 2s tend to have really bad audio. It only got like kind of decent with the VA3 and VA4, but anything before that, nah, it just sounds terrible stock. Video quality wise though, these tend to be kind of hit or miss. I personally have had better video quality out of the VA1. The VA0 is pretty bad though, I'm not gonna lie there. But even then, like, the video output might be good on this. I still think it's a good idea to install the 3BP on it, just so that way we can make it even better. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to cut to me throwing the shell parts in the bath, of course, but after that, we're going to first start by removing all the capacitors on this board in preparation for a recap. So without further delay, let's get to it. Now that we have the shell cleaned up, we can begin the process of prepping this board for a recap and the 3BP install. Now, if we were just simply doing the 3BP install, we would only have to remove the following components as highlighted with these two diagrams. This is for the audio portion of the 3BP, and we will be making sure that they are excluded when we install the new capacitors. But in addition to those components, we need to remove the rightmost op amp on the board. This is because when we install the 3BP, this op amp will be left floating, which can potentially introduce extra noise in the audio if left in circuit. So, without further delay, let's get to removing some components. And with all the caps and components removed, we can now begin recapping the system. Now, to make sure I don't accidentally repopulate any caps that are meant to be off, I did make sure to mark the capacitor landings with an X to indicate to not populate these. And as well, I will need to grab some 0 ohm jumpers because R72 and R73 need to be jumped. So with that out of the way, let's get to installing some caps. So with all the new caps and ASIC jumpers installed, we have just a little bit of prep work left. First off, we need to add 2 jumper wires from the rightmost pads of R22 and R24, and they need to be soldered to the leftmost pads of R33 and R36. This will give us an easier path to attach our FM signals to the 3BP by reusing 2 of the otherwise unused capacitor pads. As well, we need to lift the RGB outputs of the encoder, so they are not in circuit with the RGB output of the 3BP mod. Regardless of what encoder is on the board, it's the same 3 pins. We need to lift pins 21, 22, and 23 of the encoder. Now, this might be a little tricky to do, but let's see if we can get it all on camera. If not, you may see a jump cut to the next clip. Now with all the topside prep work done, we now need to cut down some of the excess leads around here so the 3BP can live comfortably. Now, in order to get all of this as flush as possible, what we can do is desolder the pads, trim the leads, and solder it back on. Now, the instructions say that we should bend over the power pins here, but the center barrel pin is too thick to be bent over, so we will have to trim the lead ever so slightly on that instead. The outer barrel pin, however, we can desolder and fold over. Afterwards, we can just plop the 3BP board in place and solder it in. So let's not waste any time and get to it. Okay, so I had a bit of an epiphany as I was working on preparing the bottom side for the triple bypass. But one of the most common issues with the Genesis Model 2 is the DC barrel jack here. The solder joints underneath tend to crack and lose connection, so as a result, the board will have no power. So what I realized is the back post here, which is the center pin, connects straight to the common node choke here. So if we, touch it with the multimeter, this confirms it. So what we can do is we can run a wire from the back of the barrel jack here straight to the common node choke. So that way, even if the joint underneath cracks, it will still have a stable connection straight to the board. So let's try that out. All right, so we got the little jumper patch installed. Now, instead of using a wire, I happen to have a really thick conductor leg, which this, I think, came from a power supply capacitor. But that aside, if we did this correctly, we shouldn't have any shorts between the center pin and the outer pin. Looks like we don't, and just to verify, nope. And nope. So that means we should only have connection from the center pin to the common node choke. And we do. So great. That means that even if the solder joints fatigue on the bottom, this will ensure a solid connection, and therefore we should always have power going to the board no matter what. So with that out of the way, we can now flip this board back over. Let's move it to position. There we go. Gonna plop this into place, solder it up, and get it going. So first order of business is we're just going to solder up all the jumpers. So considering we are installing in a VA1 system, we need to solder jumpers 2, C, and E. So let's grab our solder here, some flux. So we're just gonna splash a little bit on 2, C, and E. Grab our soldering iron here. Oop, I just hit the microphone cord. E, C, come on, there we go, 2, and 2. Great. So now it's configured for this board. We just need to solder it onto the DIN side and start our cable management, starting with the RGB pins. Alright, so we got the RGB lines all hooked up here, and you may notice that we did not run a sync wire, and the reason why is we don't need to run a sync wire for the Model 2 Genesis because sync is already present on the DIN side of things. Now, if we were installing this in a Model 1, which bypasses the original DIN to begin with, then we would have to wire the sync wire, but since this is a Model 2, don't need to worry about it. So that out of the way, what we need to do now is install our audio wires. Now, one quick note that I want to make. Typically, when people install the audio wires on these Model 2 Genesis consoles, they'll usually take their conductor cables and they'll lay it over the cartridge slot. And I absolutely hate that for a couple reasons. One, you really don't want these audio signals to be over the cartridge bus as it could pick up some excess noise. And two, typically when people do that, they end up having to chip away at this. Now this is a little cartridge guard, so that way the whole board is elevated from the bottom shielding. So in order to make this work like this, you would have to cut into this plastic here in order to make a little channel for the wires to pass through. I absolutely hate that. I think it looks ugly and it's just way too much work for what's essentially something completely avoidable. So what I personally like to do though is I like to keep the cartridge guard on and take a ribbon cable. I don't think this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, this is one conductor short, so this is just for visual. So I'll take the ribbon conductor here and then I'll just try to fold it in such a way that avoids the cartridge guard. So that way we can ensure that all the audio signals go into place and it's not going over any data signals. So with that out of the way, let me cut up some new ribbon cable and get the audio wires done. And with that, we got all the audio wires installed. So if all you wanted was clean RGB and clean audio, that would be the end of the process. Just test the system, make sure everything looks good on your screen, and you're good to go. But my friend wants composite video intact as well, so we will now be moving forward to the really neat feature of the 3BP V2 Plus, and that's the RGB outputs for the encoder circuit. So to restore composite video back into our Genesis Model 2, we are going to need to remove the resistors R64, R63, and R62, and attach our RGB outputs from the triple bypass to R58, R59, and R60. Doing this will restore composite video functionality back into the system, and it will look noticeably cleaner than it did originally. Although, when we go to test it, it may not look so good due to my crappy AV cables for the Sega Genesis, but rest assured, it is a noticeable improvement with good cabling. So without further delay, let's get to installing the RGB outputs. Alright, and with that, the mod is complete. So all we gotta do now is get this thing in the bottom shell and give it a test. Okay, so we have this system all hooked up. I got my power and RGB cables all hooked up. As you can see, we're on RGB mode. So now we're just gonna hit the power and see if it works. And that's a good sign so far. I do see some blue around Rocket Knight Adventures. We got blue on the Sega logo. And it's looking like the RGB mod worked. And we still have sound, so that's good too. But yeah, looks like the mod was a success. But let's just power this off real quick. But we got one more thing to test. Just gonna unplug that and grab our composite cable. Very tight fit. Scroll down to composite. Hit the power button. And it looks like we still have composite video. Let's just make sure that we have color on composite. And it's looking like we still do. And we still have sound, so you know what? Successful mod. We got composite restored and we got clean RGB. So now that we've confirmed the mod works, let's button the system back up and give some final thoughts. And with that, the system is now finished. We got the system fully recapped, and we got the best 3BP mod installed into it. And really, that's all the system needs to be something truly amazing. There's no need for any mods that tout themselves as a 3BP killer, when a proper 3BP install does wonders for those who actually want the most out of their Sega Genesis without something overly complicated that was also presented with AI. And I'm sure when my friend gets his system back, he will be inclined to agree. Now with that said, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.